If you think loyalty is a shield, you're only half right. For 50 years, I believed my loyalty to my church, to my pastor, was a suit of armor I wore, protecting me from the jagged edges of the world. It turns out that armor had a hidden clasp, one that could only be opened from the outside, and the man I trusted most knew exactly where it was. My name is Raymond, I'm 74 years old, and this is the story of how I discovered that the most dangerous wolves are the ones you invite into your home every Sunday. It's a story about faith, greed, and a judgment of a more temporal kind. My life for the last half-century has been measured by the ringing of the bells at St. Jude's Community Church. It's where I married my Eleanor, where we baptized our son Mark, and where just 3 years ago I said my final goodbye to her. The church wasn't just a building of brick and stained glass. It was the framework of my existence, the one constant in a world that never stopped changing. And at the center of that constant was Pastor Dave. He wasn't the pastor when I first joined. His father, Pastor John, was a gentle, scholarly man who smelled of old books and peppermint. Dave took over about 25 years ago, and he brought a new energy. He was charismatic, with a booming laugh and a knack for making you feel like you were the only person in the room. When Eleanor got sick, he was there. He brought casseroles. He sat with me in the sterile hospital waiting rooms, and his eulogy for her was a masterpiece of comfort and grace. He spoke of her kindness, her quiet strength, and her unwavering faith. At the end of it, he looked directly at me, his eyes full of what I believed was genuine compassion, and said, "Raymond, you are not alone. This church, your family in Christ, we are with you." I believed him. I clung to that promise like a drowning man to a life raft. For a widower in his 70s, loneliness is a quiet predator, and Pastor Dave had seemingly chased it from my door. The change was subtle at first, like the slow turning of a season. You don't notice it day by day, but one morning you wake up and there's a chill in the air that wasn't there before. It started in his sermons. The topic shifted from grace, forgiveness, and community to something more transactional. He began speaking of sowing seeds of faith, which sounded innocent enough, but the examples he used always involved money. Then came the series on heavenly treasures versus earthly burdens. He'd stand at the pulpit, his voice resonating with practiced sincerity, and speak about the peace that comes from unburdening oneself. What good are earthly treasures? He'd boom, his eyes sweeping across the pews, always seeming to linger a little longer on the gray-haired members, when your time in this world is fleeting. What a blessing it is to know that your legacy, your life's work, can continue to serve the Lord long after you are called home. I remember shifting in my pew, a strange, sour feeling in my gut. It felt targeted. He started talking more and more about elderly members, especially those with no one to leave their earthly treasures to. He'd paint these heart-wrenching pictures of lonely seniors, their homes filled with memories but with no children or grandchildren to pass them on to. Don't let your worldly possessions become a burden for a distant relative, or worse, the state, he'd advise, his voice dropping to a confidential whisper. Secure your place in God's plan. Bless this house of the Lord, and you will be blessed in return. I tried to dismiss it as a new fundraising strategy. Churches always need money, I told myself, but it felt different. It felt predatory. The first bell of alarm, the one I couldn't ignore, came on a Tuesday afternoon. My friend Margaret, whose husband Frank had passed away just 6 months prior, called me, her voice fluttering with a strange, high-pitched excitement. Margaret and Frank had been our closest friends. We'd raised our kids together, vacationed together. I knew their finances, their lives, as well as I knew my own. Their house, a lovely little 2-story colonial on a street lined with oak trees, was their pride and joy. It was paid off. It was their nest egg, the one thing Frank had worked 60 hours a week for 40 years to secure for her. "Raymond, I have the most wonderful news," she said. "I've finally found peace. I had a long talk with Pastor Dave, and he helped me see the light." I smiled. "That's wonderful, Margaret. What's the news?" "I've given the house to the church," she said, as casually as if she were telling me she'd donated a bag of old clothes. The line went silent. I thought I'd misheard. "You've what?" I signed it over. Pastor Dave had a lawyer from the church's foundation draw up the papers and everything. "It's a special kind of trust," he said. "I get to live in it for the rest of my life, of course, but when I'm gone, it belongs to St. Jude's. Isn't that a blessing? My home, Frank's home, will be doing God's work forever." I felt the blood drain from my face. My hand tightened on the receiver. "Margaret, did you talk to your kids about this? Did you talk to a lawyer of your own?" Her voice cooled instantly. "My children are in California, Raymond. They have their own lives, and Pastor Dave said using the church's lawyer would save me the expense and bother. He was so thoughtful. He said this was about my spiritual peace, not legal wrangling. You of all people should understand that." But I didn't. I understood that a grieving, lonely, 76-year-old woman had just been counseled into signing away her single greatest asset by the man we were supposed to trust with our souls. I saw the hook, the line, and the sinker. The sermon about earthly burdens wasn't a metaphor anymore. It was a business plan. Standing in my quiet kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator suddenly deafening, I felt the 50-year-old foundation of my faith crack right down the middle. Pastor Dave was about to face a judgment. All right, but I had a feeling it wasn't going to be the divine kind he was always preaching about. The phone call with Margaret left a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth. It was the taste of betrayal. I tried to reason with her, gently at first. I drove over to her house the next day, the same house where I'd had countless barbecues with her and Frank. The lawn Frank was so meticulous about now looking a little shaggy around the edges. She let me in, but there was a new wariness in her eyes, a defensive shield that Pastor Dave had clearly helped her erect. "Margaret, I'm just concerned," I began, sitting in Frank's old armchair, which felt profoundly wrong. "A house is a major asset. It's your security. What if you need money for long-term care later on?" She just smiled, this beatific, pitying smile. "Raymond, you worry too much about worldly things. Pastor Dave says faith is our security. The church will care for me. I'm part of their legacy now." Every argument I made, every practical concern I raised, she deflected with a quote from a recent sermon or a platitude Dave had fed her. It was like talking to a recording. He had insulated her from reason with a thick blanket of spiritual jargon. He hadn't just taken her house. He had taken her critical thinking, replacing it with his own. I left her house that day feeling sick to my stomach. He had preyed on her grief, her loneliness, her fear of being a burden, and twisted it into an act of piety. It was disgusting. That night, sleep wouldn't come. I found myself pacing the floors of my own silent house, a house filled with memories of Eleanor. I walked into my study, a room lined with books and old photographs. There was a picture of me and Eleanor on our wedding day, standing on the steps of St. Jude's Sis. We were so young, so full of a simple, uncomplicated faith in the world, and our place in it. Pastor John, Dave's father, had officiated. He was a man who believed faith was about what you put into people, not what you took out of them. He'd have been horrified by this. I sank into my chair, the leather sighing under my weight. My mind drifted back through the decades. I remembered bringing our son Mark to be baptized. He was just a tiny thing wrapped in an heirloom blanket. Eleanor had knitted. Pastor John held him up, his voice soft but sure, and welcomed him into the community. Years later, it was Pastor Dave who confirmed Mark. Dave was younger then, his ambitions still tempered by his father's legacy. He was energetic, and the youth group thrived under him. He organized food drives and community cleanup days. He seemed, for all the world, to be a good man. The most vivid memory, the one that made this current betrayal so sharp, was of Eleanor's last days. The cancer had been aggressive, and the end was not peaceful. I was frayed, exhausted, and barely holding myself together. Dave was a constant presence. He wouldn't stay long, but he'd pop in, bring me a coffee, sit with Eleanor while I took a shower, and just be there. He'd read scripture to her. his voice a low, soothing balm in the tense, quiet house. At her funeral, his words were a lifeline. He captured her essence so perfectly, her quiet humor, her fierce love for her family. He spoke of her as a pillar of the church, a woman of unshakable faith. And when he looked at me and promised that my church family would be my rock, the sincerity in his eyes felt as real as the grief in my own heart. Had it all been an act? Was that kindness just a long-term investment, grooming me, one of the flock, for a future shearing? The thought was so cynical, so ugly, that I almost pushed it away. But then I thought of Margaret's house. The seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing into a thorny, choking weed in the garden of my memory. Every act of kindness I'd received from him was now suspect, every comforting word tainted. I needed to talk to someone. My first and only thought was Mark, my son.
He's a financial advisor, a numbers man.
He's pragmatic, logical. Surely he would see the glaring red flags in Margaret's situation. I picked up the phone, my heart pounding a little. We hadn't been as close since Eleanor passed. He was busy with his own family, his career, and I think my grief was a heavy thing he didn't quite know how to handle. He loved me, I knew, but he saw me as fragile, a relic from a bygone era to be managed and protected. "Dad, everything okay?" "It's late," he answered, his voice already edged with tired efficiency. I took a deep breath and laid it all out. The sermons, the focus on the elderly, and what had happened to Margaret. I explained the concept of her losing control of her primary asset, the legal sleight of hand I suspected was at play. I waited for the outrage, the "I'll call her first thing in the morning," the shared sense of injustice. Instead there was a long, weary sigh. "Dad," he said, and I could hear him pinching the bridge of his nose. "It's a church. People donate. It's what they do. Margaret is a grown woman. Maybe this gives her comfort. Mark, she's a grieving widow. He's targeting her. He's taking advantage of her." "You don't know that," he said, his voice taking on that frustratingly patient tone he used when he thought I was being irrational. "Pastor Dave is a good man. Mom loved him. He helped us. He helped you. You're just upset because you're lonely and you're projecting. Maybe you should get out more, join a club or something. Don't go making trouble at the one place you still have a community." The condescension was a physical blow. He wasn't hearing me. He was hearing old man. He was hearing senile. "I am not projecting," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "I am telling you that something is rotten at the heart of that church." "Okay, Dad. Look, I have an early meeting. Let's not get worked up. Just be careful. Don't go around making accusations you can't prove. It could get ugly. You could get sued for slander." And with that he was gone. I hung up the phone, feeling more alone than I had since the day Eleanor died. My own son, the person I had baptized in that church, thought I was losing my mind. The man I had trusted with my soul was a predator, and my own child thought he was a saint, and I was a fool. A cold, hard clarity washed over me. The grief and confusion I'd been feeling began to crystallize into something else, something solid and unyielding. Resolve. No one was going to help me. No one else saw the wolf. They all still saw the shepherd. Mark's dismissal, as painful as it was the final catalyst. It wasn't just about Margaret anymore. It was about my own judgment, my own sanity. It was about the 50 years of my life I had poured into that place. It was about Eleanor's memory, which Dave was now tarnishing with his greed. I stood up and walked back to my study. I turned on the desk lamp, the pool of light pushing back the shadows. I was a retired accountant. For 42 years, my job had been to find discrepancies, to follow the money, to make sure the columns balanced. My mind, which my son seemed to think was failing, was in fact the sharpest tool I had. I pulled out a fresh legal pad and a pen. At the top of the page, I wrote Pastor Dave. It wasn't about revenge, I told myself, trying to hold on to the man I used to be. It was about truth. It was about protecting the flock. But as I sat there in the quiet of my home, the sting of my son's words still fresh. A colder, harder thought echoed in the silence. It wasn't about revenge until it was, and it was now. I was going to uncover every dirty little secret, and I was going to make the columns balance, one way or another. My quiet questions were over. The investigation had begun. The first step of any good audit is to establish a baseline. I needed to understand the before to truly quantify the after. My basement was a meticulously organized archive of my life. Down in the cool, dry air, surrounded by the faint, pleasant smell of aging paper, were boxes labeled by year. I started with St. Jude Cess. I had decades of church bulletins, annual financial reports, handed out at sparsely attended congregational meetings, and my own canceled checks for every donation I'd ever made. I was methodical. I was in my element. I spread the documents across my large work table. For hours I did what I used to do for a living. I looked for patterns. For the first 20 years of Pastor Dave's tenure, the church's finances were predictable. The annual reports showed income from the collection plate, a modest endowment left by his father, and occasional capital campaigns for things like a new roof or an organ repair. Everything was transparent. The appeals for money were broad, community-focused. Then, about 5 years ago, the language started to change. It coincided, I noted grimly, with the passing of a few of the church's wealthiest founding members. A new line item appeared in the financial reports: legacy giving. The first year it was a small amount. The next it was significantly larger. Last year it accounted for nearly 40% of the church's total income. Yet there was no corresponding detail. It was just a single opaque number. Where was this money coming from? And more importantly, where was it going? There were no new community programs, no major building improvements that would justify such a massive influx of cash. The church looked the same as it always did, perhaps a little more worn around the edges. This was the first thread. An accountant's instinct is like a dog's sense of smell. Once you catch a scent, you have to follow it. The problem was, I needed more than old paperwork. I needed to talk to people. But I couldn't just go door to door accusing the pastor of fraud. My son was right about one thing. That would be slander, and it would be my word against a man beloved by the community. I had to be smarter than that. I had to be a friend, a concerned fellow parishioner. My age, the very thing that made my son dismiss me, was now my greatest asset. Who would suspect a quiet, grieving widower of conducting a covert investigation? I made a list. I started with Silas Croft. Silas was a cranky 80-year-old bachelor, a retired history professor, who had been a fixture in the back left pew for as long as I could remember. I'd noticed him looking increasingly agitated after services lately, often slipping out before the coffee hour. I found him tending his prize-winning roses. "Silas," I began, leaning on the fence that separated our properties. "Those are looking more beautiful than ever." He grunted, not looking up from his pruning. "Roses are honest. You give them what they need. They give you beauty. Can't say the same for people." There was my opening. "Is everything all right, Silas? You seem troubled lately." He finally straightened up, wiping his brow with the back of a dirt-caked glove. He squinted at me. "Troubled? No, Raymond. I'm being counseled." He said the word dripping with sarcasm. "Pastor Dave is very concerned about my eternal soul, and coincidentally, the disposition of my rather significant collection of first edition history books." I kept my face neutral. "Oh, he's taken an interest in history." Silas let out a short, sharp laugh. "He's taken an interest in their auction value. He tells me they are a worldly attachment, a vanity. He suggests I'd find more spiritual peace if I amended my will to leave the collection to the church's legacy library. A library, I might add, that doesn't seem to exist." My blood ran cold. It was the same pattern, a different verse. "What did you say?" I told him books are promised to the university. He was displeased. He told me I was letting pride stand in the way of God's blessing. The man has the subtlety of a debt collector. Silas shook his head and went back to his roses. Watch yourself, Raymond. There's a collection plate, and then there's a shakedown. Our pastor no longer seems to know the difference. One down. Next was Beatrice Miller, a sweet woman in her late 70s, whose husband had passed a few years before Eleanor. She was known for being a bit scattered, but had a heart of gold. I caught her on her way back from the grocery store. I helped her with her bags, and we sat in her small, tidy living room, which was filled with photos of her grandchildren. I approached it differently with her. I talked about my own loneliness, about how hard financial planning was without Eleanor. This opened the door. Beatrice confessed she'd been overwhelmed. I just didn't know what to do with the bit of money Al left me, she said, her hands fluttering in her lap. It was in some sort of annuity. The statements were so confusing. Pastor Dave was a godsend. He sat right here on this sofa and helped me sort it all out. He did. I asked, my voice gentle. Oh, yes. He said it was too complicated for a woman my age to manage and that the market was too risky. He had a much better idea. He helped me move it all into the church's perpetual charity fund. He said it gets a much better return, and it's protected, and it does good work. It felt like such a weight off my shoulders. Did he give you any paperwork, Beatrice? A prospectus for this fund? She looked confused. Well, he said, the church handles all that. He said the important thing was the peace in my heart. Not a stack of papers. He hadn't just taken her nest egg. He had done it without leaving a single document in her possession. It was brilliant and utterly evil. I left Beatrice's house with a knot of fury in my chest. He was using their trust, their financial illiteracy, and their faith as weapons against them. I spent the next 2 weeks like this, having quiet coffees, making sympathetic phone calls, piecing together the story one heartbreaking conversation at a time. I found 2 more cases. An elderly couple, the Martins, who were pressured into taking out a reverse mortgage on their home with a church-affiliated lender to make a significant donation. A man named Henry, who had recently lost his wife and was convinced to change the beneficiary on his life insurance policy from his estranged nephew to St. Jude. I documented everything. I bought a simple black ledger from the office supply store. On each page, I dedicated it to a victim. Name Margaret Peterson, asset house valued at approx. $450,000. Method spiritual counseling post-bereavement. Direct deed transfer via church lawyer. Name Silas Croft. Asset book collection valued at approx. $150,000. Method pressure to amend will, guilt over worldly attachments. Attempted. Name Beatrice Miller. Asset annuity. Approx. $85,000. Method transferred to unsupervised church fund. No documentation provided. By the time I was done, I had 5 solid cases, each one a different shade of the same ugly color. This was a systematic campaign of predatory deception targeting the most vulnerable members of his flock. Now I had the what, but I needed to do something with it. Going to the police felt premature. It would be a messy public affair, and my evidence, while compelling to me, was still largely circumstantial. I needed to handle this from within. I needed to go to the elders. There were 3 elders at St. Jude. The first was Robert Sterling, a retired insurance salesman and one of Dave's oldest friends. He was a lost cause, a man who would see no evil in his friend. The second was Gerald Fine, a younger man in his 50s who ran a successful chain of hardware stores. He was pragmatic, business-minded, but also a bit of a social climber. He valued the church's reputation. He was a maybe. The third, and my only real hope, was Arthur Pendleton. Arthur was 82, a retired Superior Court judge, and a man whose integrity was as solid as the granite courthouse he'd presided in for 30 years. He was quiet, observant, and missed nothing. He was also a stickler for rules and due process. If I could convince Arthur, I had a chance. I called him and asked to meet. We met not at the church, but at a neutral location, a small, quiet coffee shop downtown. I came prepared. I didn't bring my whole ledger of woe. That would be overwhelming. I brought just one thing, a single sheet of paper. On it I had drawn a simple timeline. "Arthur," I said after we had exchanged pleasantries, "I'm here because I'm deeply concerned. I'm not going to make any accusations. I'm just going to show you this and ask you what you think." I slid the paper across the table. It had 3 dates on it. Date 1, Frank Peterson's funeral. Date 2, a series of 6 entries labeled pastoral counseling, listing the dates of Dave's visits to Margaret in the following months. Date 3, the date the deed for Margaret Peterson's house was officially recorded with the county clerk's office, transferring ownership to the St. Jude's Legacy Foundation. Arthur put on his reading glasses and studied the paper for a long time. He didn't say a word. He just stared at the dates, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. He looked at the short, brutal timeline that showed a woman going from grieving widow to losing her home in less than 6 months. He didn't need me to connect the dots. A judge knows how to read evidence. Finally, he took off his glasses and looked at me, his eyes clear and serious. "This is one piece of paper, Raymond." "I know," I said, "but I have more. I have 4 other stories just like it." He was silent for another minute. He wasn't just a judge. He was a man who had also put his faith in Pastor Dave. I could see the struggle behind his eyes, the desire to disbelieve clashing with the cold, hard logic of the timeline in front of him. "Get me something more," he said finally, his voice low. "Get me sworn, notarized statements from these other people. Get me copies of whatever documents you can find. Don't just bring me stories. Bring me a case. If you can do that, I will call a formal meeting. But Raymond," he added, his gaze sharp as a shard of glass, "if you are wrong about this, you will have destroyed a good man's reputation for nothing." "I understand," I said, "and I'm not wrong. I left the coffee shop with a clear mission. I had to go back to Silas, Beatrice, and the others. I had to ask them to put their names on paper, to turn their whispered fears into a formal record. Arthur had given me the path. Now I just had to walk it. It was time to build my case. My first task was to create the reports. I was an accountant, not a lawyer, but I knew the power of clear, professional presentation. This couldn't look like the ramblings of a bitter old man. It had to look like an audit. I bought 3 high-quality binders, 1 for each elder. For the next week, my study became a war room. I typed up my notes from each interview, creating a formal summary for each of the 5 cases. I kept the language cold, factual, and devoid of emotion. Subject A, Margaret Peterson, recently widowed. Subject B, Pastor David Maxwell initiated a series of undocumented counseling sessions. Outcome, transfer of primary residence. The hardest part was going back to the victims and asking for notarized statements. These were people who had been betrayed by an authority figure. Their trust was a fragile, shattered thing. Asking them to trust me to put their name on a document that could bring them into open conflict with their pastor was a monumental request. I started with Silas, the cranky rose gardener. I laid out my binder on his kitchen table. He read through my summary of his experience, grunting occasionally. "So you're actually doing it," he said, looking at me with a newfound respect. "You're going to fight the dragon. I'm going to present the facts to the elders, Silas. For them to do that, I need your story to be more than just a conversation between neighbors. I need it on paper. I need it notarized." He stared out the window at his garden for a long moment. He counts on us being old, tired, and scared. He counts on us not wanting to make a fuss. He looked back at me, his eyes steely. "All right, Raymond, give me the blasted paper. It's time someone made a fuss. Beatrice was harder. She was terrified. But he was so kind, she kept saying, even after I gently walked her through how he had taken her annuity. The idea that his kindness was a tool of deception was a truth too painful for her to easily accept. Beatrice, I said, sitting with her on that same sofa where Dave had counseled her, I know this is hard, but he didn't just do this to you. He did it to Margaret. He tried to do it to Silas. He will keep doing it to others if we stay silent. Your story, your courage, could protect someone else from this. That was what finally reached her. The idea of protecting someone else. Her innate kindness was the key. With tears in her eyes, she agreed to sign. One by one, I collected them all. I found a mobile notary, a kind young woman who came to their homes, patiently waiting as they read and signed their statements, her official stamp pressing a seal of truth onto their fear and pain. I assembled the 3 binders. Each one was identical. A cover page titled An Inquiry into the Financial Practices of the St. Jude's Legacy Foundation, followed by the 5 case summaries, copies of the notarized statements, and the damning timeline of Margaret's deed transfer. At the back, I included a copy of the church's own bylaws, with the section on the fiduciary duties of the pastor and elders highlighted in yellow. It was a cold, professional, and undeniable dossier of wrongdoing. The following Saturday, I delivered them. I drove to each elder's home, leaving the heavy binders on their front porches without a word. I didn't ring the bell. I just let the documents speak for themselves. The silent takeover had begun. The effect was immediate. That Sunday, the atmosphere in the church was thick with an unspoken tension. Pastor Dave mounted the pulpit, but his usual confident swagger was gone. He looked out over the congregation, and his eyes found mine for a fleeting second. There was no warmth in them. There was a flicker of something cold and sharp recognition. His sermon was a masterpiece of passive aggression. He didn't mention me by name, but he didn't have to. He spoke of Satan sowing seeds of discord and whispers of slander in our very midst. He talked about the trials of leadership and how a true man of God will be tested by lies and envy. He was trying to inoculate the congregation, to frame any accusation against him as a spiritual attack. He was painting me as a devil before anyone even knew my name. Some of the older members glanced at me with worried expressions. His message was landing. The first call came that afternoon. It was from Robert Sterling, Dave's loyal friend. His tone was syrupy, patronizing. "Raymond, my boy, I got your package. Now I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. Dave has a huge heart. You know that. Sometimes his passion for helping the church gets ahead of him. That's all. Why don't we all sit down, you, me, and Dave, and have a prayer? We can clear this all up." "There is nothing to clear up, Robert," I said calmly. "There are only the facts. Did you read the report?" There was a slight hesitation. I skimmed it. It's a lot of hearsay. People get confused. You know how it is. He wanted to bury it. The next call, an hour later, was from Pastor Dave himself. His voice was smooth as honey, but I could hear the coiled snake beneath it. "Brother Raymond," he began, the false piety making my skin crawl, "Elder Sterling tells me you've compiled some concerns. I'm so sorry to hear you're feeling troubled. My door is always open. We should talk and pray together. It would be a profound tragedy for discord to be sown in our flock after all these years of fellowship. We wouldn't want things to get unpleasant." It was a threat wrapped in a prayer. Unpleasant. He was letting me know he would fight, and he would fight dirty. "The time for prayer and talk is over, Dave," I said, using his name without the title for the first time in 25 years. "It's time for an accounting." I hung up the phone before he could respond. The final call of the day was the one that truly hurt. It was Mark. His voice was tight with anger and embarrassment. "Dad, what in the hell are you doing?" "Pastor Dave just called me. He said he's deeply worried about your mental state. He said you're spreading vicious rumors and that he's trying to protect you from legal action." "Legal action, Dad? You're accusing a pillar of the community of being a crook. You're making our family a laughingstock. He's manipulating you, Mark, just like he manipulates everyone else." I said, my voice weary. No, Dad. You're the one who's not thinking clearly. You're a lonely old man who's mad at the world because Mom is gone, and you're taking it out on the one person who was kindest to you. Drop this. Drop it now before you ruin your own life and embarrass the rest of us." He hung up. The silence that followed was heavier than any I had ever known. My pastor saw me as an enemy. My fellow church members were being turned against me, and my own son, my only child, thought I was senile and malicious. For a moment a wave of despair washed over me. The sheer weight of what I had taken on, the isolation of it, threatened to crush me. I sat in my study, the empty binders on my desk, and felt the full force of being utterly alone in my conviction. But then the despair receded, replaced again by that cold, hard resolve. They thought I was a weak, confused old man. They were about to find out how wrong they were. The panic I was hearing in their voices told me one thing. My quiet audit was working. The numbers weren't adding up for them, and they were starting to sweat. The days following the delivery of my reports were a study in escalating pressure. Pastor Dave was a master of the subtle campaign. He didn't attack me from the pulpit again, not directly. Instead, he began a series of spontaneous prayer circles after the service, gathering small groups of influential members around him. I'd watch from a distance as he'd speak in low, earnest tones, his head bowed, his hand often resting on someone's shoulder. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see the effect. Faces would turn towards me, not with anger, but with a deep, sorrowful pity. He was framing me as a lost sheep, a troubled soul consumed by grief and confusion. It was a far more effective strategy than open warfare. He was positioning himself as my compassionate shepherd, even as he branded me a threat. His most desperate and most brilliant countermove came the following Sunday. He announced a special service of testimony. The church was packed. He began with a sermon on the joy of giving, his voice thick with emotion. Then he said, "But don't take my word for it. Let's hear from someone who has experienced the profound peace of a legacy gift." He extended a hand. "Margaret, would you come and share your heart with us?" My blood turned to ice. Margaret, looking frail and smaller than ever, walked slowly to the pulpit, clutching a tissue in her hand. Dave stood beside her, a protective arm around her shoulder. She looked out at the congregation, her eyes glassy with tears. "My Frank is gone," she began, her voice trembling. "And this house, it was so empty. Just me and the memories. I was so lost. And then Pastor Dave, he sat with me. He prayed with me, and he helped me see that my home wasn't an ending. It could be a new beginning." She looked over at Dave with pure adoration. "He helped me turn my earthly burden into a heavenly blessing. By giving my home to the church, to God's work, I finally feel peace. Frank's legacy, my legacy, is secure, and I have a family here that will care for me always." She started to cry, and Dave hugged her tightly, patting her back. "Thank you, Margaret," he whispered into the microphone. "Thank you for your faith." The church was silent for a moment, and then a wave of amens and quiet applause washed through the pews. It was a devastatingly effective performance. He had used my friend's genuine grief and his manufactured peace as a shield. He turned her into a living, breathing testament to his righteousness. In that moment, to everyone else in that room, I was the villain. I was the cruel old man trying to snatch this poor widow's comfort away from her. I saw it in their eyes as they glanced my way. Disappointment, confusion, even a few glares of outright hostility. My carefully constructed case of facts and figures was being washed away by a tide of weaponized emotion. He wasn't done. He then had Elder Robert Sterling stand up and give an impassioned speech about the church's desperate need for a new youth center. "Friends," Robert boomed, "we are losing our children to the streets. We need a safe place, a beacon of hope. Gifts like Margaret's, they are the foundation upon which we will build our future." It was a lie, of course. I knew from the financial reports there was no budget, no plan, no line item for a youth center. It was a phantom project, a convenient excuse cooked up to justify the sudden influx of cash from his legacy program. But the congregation didn't know that. They just heard about saving the children. How could my binders full of numbers compete with that? I walked out of the church that day feeling as though I'd been publicly flogged. My credibility was in tatters. Dave had outmaneuvered me, using the very people I was trying to protect as pawns in his game. I felt a pang of doubt. Had I underestimated him? Was he simply too good at this, too entrenched, too beloved? As I reached my car in the parking lot, a voice called my name, Raymond. I turned. It was Arthur Pendleton, the retired judge. He had been sitting in his car watching. He got out and walked slowly towards me, his face impassive. My heart sank. I expected him to tell me the case was closed, that I had lost. He stopped in front of me, his expression unreadable. "That was quite a piece of theater," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Arthur," I started, ready to defend myself. He held up a hand, stopping me. "I'm a judge, Raymond. I've spent 30 years watching lawyers perform for a jury. I know the difference between evidence and a performance. And that," he said, nodding back towards the church, "was a performance." A sliver of hope returned. "He's panicking," Arthur continued. "That display in there, the public testimony, the Phantom Youth Center, those aren't the actions of a confident man. Those are the desperate moves of a man who knows he's been caught and is trying to control the narrative before the facts come out." He looked me straight in the eye. "I've been making some calls of my own this past week. I have a friend at the county clerk's office. Margaret's deed transfer isn't the only one to the St. Jude's Legacy Foundation. There have been 3 others in the last 2 years, all from elderly, recently widowed or unmarried members of our congregation, all notarized by the same lawyer." He let that sink in. He had independently verified my findings. "I also spoke to a friend who is a forensic accountant," Arthur went on, his voice dropping even lower. "I asked him, hypothetically, about these kinds of church foundations. He said it's a classic setup. Often the foundation is a separate legal entity, a 501c3, but with bylaws that give the director, in this case Pastor Dave, sole discretion over the funds. It can look like the money is going to the church, when in fact it's going into a black box that only he controls." The power shift was palpable. I was no longer a lone accuser. I had a powerful, methodical ally. I was no longer just Raymond, the crazy old man. I was a witness. "I'm calling an emergency meeting of the elders," Arthur said, his voice now crisp with judicial authority. "Tuesday night, 7 o'clock in the church office. I'm invoking the clause in the bylaws that allows for a hearing on pastoral conduct. Gerald Fine will be there. So will Robert, and so will Dave." He paused. "And I want you there too, Raymond. You will not be the accuser. You will be a witness. I will run the proceedings." He put a firm hand on my shoulder. "Go home, get some rest, and let the process work." As he walked away, I felt the crushing weight of the past few weeks begin to lift. The tide hadn't gone out. It was just turning. Tuesday night, the church was dark and silent, a stark contrast to the bright, noisy fellowship of a Sunday morning. The only light came from the church office, a small wood-paneled room off the main sanctuary. When I walked in, the other 4 men were already there, seated around a large oak conference table. The air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Pastor Dave sat at the head of the table, attempting to project an aura of calm authority, but his knuckles were white where he gripped his pen. Robert Sterling, his loyal friend, sat to his right, looking defiant. Gerald Fine, the businessman, sat opposite, his face a mask of anxious neutrality. He clearly hated this, the potential for a scandal that could tarnish the church's, and by extension, his reputation. And at the other end of the table sat Arthur Pendleton. He had placed a single thick binder in front of him. He looked less like a church elder, and more like the judge he once was, about to bring a courtroom to order. He nodded for me to take the empty seat next to him. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," Arthur began, his voice calm and measured, carrying the unmistakable weight of command. "Under Section 4, Paragraph 2 of our church bylaws. I have called this meeting to review a matter of grave concern regarding the financial conduct of our pastor and the administration of church assets. Dave immediately bristled. Arthur, with all due respect, this is highly irregular. These are baseless accusations from a troubled member of our flock. This should be a matter for pastoral care, not a formal tribunal. Arthur didn't even look at him. He opened his binder. This is not a tribunal, David. It is a meeting of the Board of Elders, fulfilling our fiduciary duty. Now let's start with the St. Jude's Legacy Foundation. Robert, Gerald, were you aware that this foundation is a legally separate entity from the church, incorporated 2 years ago, with Pastor Dave as the sole director and signatory on its accounts? Robert and Gerald exchanged a confused look. Well, no, not in those specific terms, Gerald stammered. I thought it was just a name for our endowment fund. It is not, Arthur said flatly. It is a 501c3 charity, and according to the documents filed with the state, its assets are not under the control of this elder board. He slid a copy of the incorporation papers across the table. Dave's face paled slightly. That was simply for administrative efficiency, Arthur, to streamline the process of legacy giving. Was it also for administrative efficiency that you counseled Margaret Peterson to sign over her home to this foundation, using a lawyer paid for by the foundation, without advising her to seek independent counsel? Arthur's voice was like chipping ice. I was providing spiritual comfort. Dave retorted, his voice rising. Margaret was overjoyed to make that gift. You saw her yourself on Sunday. Raymond here is twisting her act of faith into something ugly and sordid. He's a bitter, lonely man, and he's poisoning this church with his paranoia. He turned his full fury on me. His pastoral mask was gone, replaced by a snarl of pure venom. For 50 years, you've sat in that pew, Raymond, and this is how you repay this church. With lies, with slander. After all I did for you, for Eleanor. I met his gaze, my heart pounding, but I didn't flinch. I just looked at him, and for the first time, I felt not fear or anger, but a profound pity for this small, grasping man. Before I could speak, Arthur held up his hand. That is enough, David. His voice was dangerously quiet. He turned a page in his binder. This is not about Raymond's feelings or your feelings. This is about facts. And here is another fact. He slid another set of papers across the table. These are bank statements for the Legacy Foundation, which I subpoenaed this morning through a court order obtained based on preliminary evidence of fiduciary malfeasance. The word subpoena hung in the air like a death sentence. Gerald Fine, the businessman, physically recoiled as if he'd been burned. Robert Sterling's jaw went slack. Dave stared at the bank statements, his face ashen. He was trapped. These statements show, Arthur continued, his voice precise and relentless, that over the last 18 months, over $200,000 has been transferred from the Legacy Foundation's account to a private investment account at a brokerage firm. An account held in one name only, David Maxwell. Silence. The only sound was the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. The youth center you and Robert spoke of so passionately on Sunday, Arthur said, his eyes boring into Dave. I can find no record of it. No architectural plans, no contractor bids, no budget proposals. It appears to be a fiction funded by the life savings of Beatrice Miller, the home of Margaret Peterson, and the assets of at least 3 other vulnerable members of your flock. Dave finally broke. He slumped in his chair, the fight draining out of him. You don't understand, he whispered, his voice hoarse. The church is struggling. I've given my life to this place. I deserved some security. A pastor's pension is nothing. It was a confession, raw, pathetic, and utterly damning. Gerald Fine found his voice first, a panicked squeak. My God, Dave, the liability, the legal exposure for the church, for us. Robert Sterling just stared at his friend, his face a mixture of shock and betrayal. The man he had defended so staunchly was a common thief. Arthur closed his binder with a soft, final thud. David Maxwell, he said, his voice ringing with the finality of a gavel strike. As of this moment, you are suspended from all pastoral duties, pending a full audit and a report to the district attorney's office. You will turn over your keys to the church, your church credit cards, and all financial records related to the foundation. You are not to contact any member of the congregation. Is that understood? Dave didn't answer. He just stared at the table, a broken man. After a long moment, he slowly reached into his pocket, pulled out a heavy ring of keys, and slid them across the polished wood. The clatter of the metal hitting the table was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of justice. It was the sound of the columns finally balancing. In the weeks that followed, a quiet but seismic shift occurred at St. Jude. Arthur, with the full backing of a shell-shocked Gerald and a penitent Robert, took temporary leadership. A carefully worded letter was sent to the entire congregation, explaining that Pastor Dave was on an indefinite leave of absence for personal and administrative reasons, and that a full independent audit of the church's finances was underway. There was no mention of fraud or theft, not yet. Arthur was determined to handle this with precision, to excise the cancer without killing the patient. A reputable law firm that specialized in non-profit malfeasance was hired. They began the slow, arduous process of unraveling Dave's web. Their first act was to file legal challenges to the recent asset transfer, citing undue influence and lack of independent counsel. Margaret's house was placed under a protective order, halting its official absorption by Dave's defunct foundation. The money from Beatrice's annuity, what was left of it in the investment account, was frozen. The fight wasn't over, but the bleeding had been stopped. The church itself was wounded. People were confused and hurt. Some, loyal to Dave, left in a huff, accusing the elders of a coup. But most stayed, drawn together by a shared sense of betrayal and a quiet determination to heal. The sermons, delivered by Arthur or visiting pastors, were simple and honest. They were about community, forgiveness, and integrity. The focus shifted away from money and back to people. The Phantom Youth Center was never mentioned again. My own life changed as well. I was no longer the pariah. Whispers followed me, but now they were of a different kind: curiosity and a dawning respect. People who had looked at me with pity now looked at me with questions in their eyes. I didn't answer them. I just nodded, sat in my usual pew, and let Arthur handle the official business. My part was done. One evening, about a month after the meeting, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find my son, Mark, standing on the porch. He looked tired and awkward, holding a crumpled copy of the church's official letter in his hand. He wouldn't meet my eye. "Can I come in, Dad?" he asked quietly. I stepped aside and let him in. We stood in the living room, the silence stretching between us. I owe you an apology," he finally mumbled, looking at the floor. "A huge one. I got this letter. I started making calls. I spoke to Mr. Pendleton's son, who I know from the club. He told me what you did." He finally looked up at me, and his eyes were full of a shame that pained me to see. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I treated you like a child. I called you a fool. I didn't listen. I didn't trust you." His voice cracked. "You were trying to protect everyone, and I wasn't there for you. I was so worried about how it looked, I never stopped to consider that you might be right." I walked over and put a hand on his shoulder. "You're here now, Mark. That's what matters." He shook his head. "It's not. I should have been here from the start. I should have been the one helping you with those binders, not questioning your sanity. You're a better man than I am, Dad." It was the breakthrough I had stopped hoping for. It wasn't about being right. It was about being seen, being trusted by my own son. We talked for hours that night, really talked, for the first time since his mother died. The wall between us, built of his grief and my own, finally came down. As I sit here now, months later, things are different. The legal process is still ongoing, but the lawyers are confident Margaret and the others will get their assets back. The church is smaller, but stronger, humbler. My relationship with Mark is better than it has been in years. He calls me for advice now, not just to check if I've taken my pills. I learned something profound through all this. Faith is a powerful, beautiful thing. It can be a source of immense strength and comfort, but it's also a vulnerability. People like Dave count on that. They count on you to mistake their title for integrity, to confuse their charisma with character. They count on you to believe that faith is a currency, something you can trade for blessings, but it's not. Faith should never ask you to sign a deed or empty your bank account. True shepherds protect their flock. They don't fleece them. And sometimes when the shepherd turns out to be a wolf, it falls to one of the old sheep to sound the alarm, not with a loud bleat, but with a quiet, methodical, and relentless search for the truth. It wasn't about revenge, not in the end. It was about restoring the balance. And now, the columns finally add up. So I want to ask you all, what do you think? Was I right to handle it through the elders, to keep it quiet for the sake of the church's survival? Or should I have gone straight to the police and let the scandal erupt publicly? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you have a story about a time you had to stand up to someone everyone else trusted, I'd truly like to hear. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories. It helps to know you're not alone. Thank you for listening.